Napoleon lost at Waterloo because of mud. Heavy rain delayed his attack by hours. That delay let the Prussian army arrive just in time to crush him. But what if the sun came out earlier? Picture dry ground. Napoleon attacks at dawn. His heavy cannons tear through the British lines before the Prussians can even get close. The British rout. Wellington surrenders. By sunset, Napoleon secures his empire. He does not die on a remote island. Instead, his legal code spreads across the entire continent. No British Empire dominating the globe. No unified Germany. America grows closer to France, and the map of Europe is rewritten forever. It all came down to a few hours of rain. One sunny morning would have changed the world we live in today. Is this the world we almost got? Let me know what you think. Napoleon lost Waterloo because of mud. He had to wait for the wet ground to dry so his heavy cannons could move. He waited until 11:30 a.m. That delay cost him his empire. But what if the rain stopped just 3 hours earlier? This is the story of how a few hours of morning sun changed the map of Europe. On June 18, 1815, the rain stops before dawn. A warm wind sweeps across the Belgian hills. Napoleon walks out of his tent at sunrise. He kneels down and grabs a handful of dirt. It crumbles. He looks at his officers and says 4 words. The guns can move. The French army does not wait. By 9 a.m., the first cannon fires. Over 100 French guns roar at once. The ground shakes. The Allied line is caught completely off guard. Wellington expected hours of quiet preparation. Instead, his troops are scrambled. French infantry moves in. They march in tight, silent columns through the smoke. The battle becomes a meat grinder. The key to the whole area is a small stone farmhouse called La Haye Sainte. In our history, the British held it for most of the day. Here, French cannons smash the walls by noon. The French flag goes up. Napoleon sees his opening. He sends his elite troops right down the middle. Marshal Ney does not make his historical mistake. He does not send cavalry alone. He coordinates horses, foot soldiers, and cannons in one massive push. The pressure on Wellington is massive. His men are exhausted. Wellington rides back and forth, desperate to keep his lines together. Then, a scout rides up to him. He is covered in mud and panic. The Prussians are still hours away. Napoleon sees the clock. He calls up his ultimate weapon, the Imperial Guard. These are his tallest, most experienced veterans. They have never lost a battle. They march through the thick smoke in perfect silence. The British Guards stand to meet them. Muskets fire at point-blank range. Bayonets clash. But the Allied line is already too weak. A gap opens in the center. French soldiers pour through. Wellington looks at the disaster. He has no choice. He gives the order. Retreat. The Allied army breaks. French cavalry chases them down the road to Brussels. The battle is over. By the time the first Prussians arrive, they do not find an ally. They find a trap. They are forced to retreat to save themselves. As night falls, the guns go silent. Thousands of men lie across the wet grass. Broken wagons, shattered muskets, abandoned flags. Napoleon rides slowly through the battlefield. No cheering, no celebration. Only exhausted soldiers watching their emperor pass. He removes his hat, looking across the fallen from both armies. Quietly, he said, "Europe has paid dearly for this day." That night, Napoleon sits in a small farmhouse. He spreads a map of Europe across a wooden table. His generals expect him to plan an invasion of England or Prussia. They want him to destroy their enemies. But Napoleon looks up and surprises them all. "We won the battle," he says. "Now we must win the peace." The room fell silent. Outside, rain began falling once more, washing the smoke from the fields of Waterloo. History had just changed, not because one army fought harder, but because one morning the ground dried a little sooner, and one decision came a few hours earlier. The map of the world is rewritten, not because of a brilliant strategy, not because of a secret weapon, but because the Belgian mud dried 3 hours faster than it did in our world. The morning after Waterloo, Europe woke up in total disbelief. For months, every newspaper had predicted the exact same ending. Napoleon would be defeated. France would surrender. The old order would be restored. Instead, the impossible had happened. The emperor had won. Messengers rode day and night across the continent, from Brussels to Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and London. Every single royal court received the same urgent report. Napoleon has defeated the Allied army. Panic spread through Europe's capitals, not because Napoleon had conquered the continent, but because no one knew what he would do next. Inside Paris, church bells rang. Huge crowds filled the streets. Veterans embraced one another. The tricolor flew from every public building. After years of war, many believed France had been given one final chance. Yet, Napoleon remained incredibly cautious. He understood something his enemies did not. Waterloo had won him time, not unlimited power. France was completely exhausted. Its economy had suffered through decades of conflict. Its people longed for stability. Another endless campaign would destroy everything he had fought to preserve. 3 days after the battle, Napoleon gathered his marshals. The room buzzed with excitement. Some urged an immediate invasion of the Netherlands. Others demanded a march toward the Rhine. Marshal Ney spoke first. "Europe is vulnerable," he said. "We must strike now." Napoleon quietly folded the battlefield map. "No," he replied. The room fell completely silent. "We have spent 20 years winning battles. It is time to win something greater." He looked around the table. "Peace." His officers exchanged uncertain glances. The word seemed almost unfamiliar. Napoleon dictated a series of letters, not declarations of war, but invitations. He proposed an international peace conference in Brussels, the same city that had expected to celebrate his defeat. Many European rulers suspected a trap. Some refused immediately. Others hesitated, but none could ignore reality. Another continental war might last another decade. The cost would be unimaginable. Reluctantly, delegations began traveling toward Brussels. By autumn, the conference opened. It became one of the most remarkable diplomatic gatherings in European history. France, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, the Netherlands, and smaller German and Italian states. For the first time, nearly every major European power sat around the same table. Not after a decisive occupation, but after a battle that convinced everyone No easy military victory remained possible. Napoleon entered the chamber without ceremony. He wore the simple uniform of a French officer, not the robes of an emperor. He addressed the delegates. "I did not come to ask Europe to surrender. I came to ask Europe to stop burying its sons." Silence filled the room. Even his greatest enemies listened. The negotiations lasted for months. Arguments grew heated. Old grievances resurfaced. Compromises seemed impossible. Yet little by little, common ground emerged. France accepted clearly defined borders. Britain secured freedom of navigation. Austria retained influence in Central Europe. Prussia received guarantees for its security. Russia accepted a balance of power rather than endless confrontation. No nation received everything it wanted. Every nation avoided another catastrophic war. The agreement became known as the Treaty of Brussels. Unlike many treaties before it, it did not seek to humiliate the defeated. Because there were no defeated nations, only exhausted ones. The treaty also created something unprecedented. A permanent council where European governments could negotiate future disputes before turning to war. Historians would later describe it as the earliest foundation of continental diplomacy. Back in Paris, the people welcomed Napoleon as both victor and peacemaker. His popularity reached heights even greater than after Austerlitz. But the emperor himself had changed. One evening, he walked alone through the gardens of the Tuileries Palace. An old officer approached him. "You won your greatest battle, sire." Napoleon looked toward the setting sun. "No," he replied. "My greatest battle was convincing Europe not to fight another." Far beyond France, factories resumed production. Farmers returned to their fields. Merchants reopened trade routes. Children who had known only war finally experienced peace. Europe remained divided. Its rivalries remained. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time in generations, the continent had discovered that diplomacy could achieve what armies never could. And history quietly turned in a new direction. The Treaty of Brussels changed Europe, but nobody knew how deeply. For the first time in decades, the continent experienced something almost forgotten: stability. The great armies remained. The forts still stood. The borders still mattered. Yet trade slowly replaced mobilization. Factories replaced battlefields. Universities expanded faster than military academies. Napoleon understood that France could never dominate Europe forever through force, but it could lead through innovation. Inside the Tuileries Palace, he gathered economists, engineers, scientists, teachers, and industrialists. Not generals. A minister looked around the room in surprise. "Where are the marshals, Your Majesty?" Napoleon smiled. "They have done their work. Now it is your turn." The room fell silent. The emperor announced what historians would later call the National Renewal Program. Thousands of kilometers of new roads connected France with Belgium, northern Italy, western Germany, and Spain. Canals linked major rivers. Harbors expanded. Bridges crossed valleys that had isolated communities for centuries. Commerce accelerated. Travel became faster, cheaper, and safer. Napoleon invested heavily in education. Primary schools opened in villages that had never before seen a classroom. Technical colleges trained engineers instead of officers. Scholarships allowed talented students from poor families to study science, mathematics, and medicine. The emperor believed that a nation's greatest resource was not land, but educated people. Industry flourished. Steam engines spread rapidly. Textile factories became more efficient. Iron production doubled. Railway experiments received generous government funding years earlier than in our own history. French engineers exchanged ideas with British inventors instead of competing behind closed borders. Innovation became international, not isolated. Meanwhile, the legal reforms introduced through the Napoleonic Code spread peacefully across Europe. Property rights strengthened. Religious minorities gained greater legal protection. Courts became more consistent. Merchants trusted contracts. Investors trusted the law. Economic confidence grew. Across the continent, cities expanded at an astonishing pace. Paris, Brussels, Milan, Munich, Barcelona, and Lyon. One young engineer from Lyon wrote in his diary, "My father marched to war. Break time for 0.35 seconds. I travel to build railways." The military changed as well. Instead of maintaining enormous armies prepared for constant invasion, European governments gradually created smaller professional forces supported by stronger diplomacy. Military academies introduced engineering, logistics, and medicine as core subjects. The lessons of the Napoleonic Wars had transformed warfare itself. Back in Paris, Napoleon walked through the newly established Imperial Polytechnic Institute. Students demonstrated mechanical inventions, precision machine tools, improved steam engines, early telegraph concepts. The emperor stopped before a young inventor working on a compact steam-powered transport carriage. Napoleon examined the machine carefully. "What do you intend to do with it?" The inventor answered without hesitation, "Make distance disappear." Napoleon smiled. "Then build it." Within a generation, steam railways connected the major cities of Western Europe. Goods crossed borders in days instead of weeks. Farmers reached distant markets. Doctors reached remote villages. Ideas spread with unprecedented speed. One evening, the emperor stood beside the Seine. Factories glowed along the river. Bridges bustled with people. Students filled cafes, discussing philosophy and engineering. Paris no longer felt like the capital of an empire. It felt like the capital of a new age. His closest advisor quietly approached. "You won Europe." Napoleon slowly shook his head. "No, I only gave Europe the chance to build itself." Far beyond France, other nations noticed. Break time 25 seconds. Some competed. Some cooperated. Most did both, because progress had become more valuable than conquest. The 19th century was no longer remembered as the century of endless wars. It became the French century, not because France ruled the world, but because it inspired it. And beyond the horizon, an even greater transformation was already beginning. The age of machines, the age of electricity, the age of ideas without borders. By the middle of the 19th century, Europe looked familiar, but it was not the Europe we know. Factories still filled the skylines. Steam engines still powered industry. Railways still crossed the continent. Yet, one crucial difference changed everything. The Industrial Revolution spread through cooperation, not constant rivalry. French engineers shared discoveries with British manufacturers. German chemists collaborated with Italian universities. Belgian steel producers exchanged techniques with Austrian workshops. Competition remained fierce, but knowledge crossed borders faster than armies ever had. The Treaty of Brussels had created more than peace. It had created trust. As trade expanded, a new generation of entrepreneurs emerged. They were less interested in supplying armies and more interested in connecting markets. Banks financed railroads instead of fortresses. Ports expanded instead of naval bases. Telegraph lines stretched from Lisbon to Warsaw. Messages that once took weeks now arrived within hours. Napoleon did not live to see all of it. He died peacefully in Paris in 1837, surrounded by family, statesmen, scientists, and veterans who had followed him across Europe. His funeral became one of the largest public gatherings in European history. Not only French citizens came to honor him. Delegations arrived from Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Italy. Even former enemies walked together through the streets of Paris. One British newspaper wrote that history will remember Napoleon as the man who ended an age of war by surviving one final battle. His successors understood the responsibility they inherited. France no longer sought domination. Instead, it became the driving force behind scientific cooperation. International engineering congresses met every year. Medical conferences shared discoveries freely. Universities welcomed students regardless of nationality. The idea of a united scientific community slowly became reality. Break time 02. Technology accelerated. Electric lighting illuminated major cities decades earlier. Improved sanitation reduced deadly epidemics. Vaccination programs spread quickly across Europe. Life expectancy began rising. Cities grew larger and healthier. The first practical electric telegraph network connected every major European capital. News traveled almost instantly. Markets responded within hours. Governments negotiated before misunderstandings became wars. Even language barriers slowly weakened. Schools across Europe encouraged multilingual education. Diplomats routinely spoke French, English, and German. Merchants learned Italian and Spanish. Students traveled abroad as part of their education. The continent became increasingly interconnected. One young inventor from Vienna unveiled an experimental flying machine. It flew only a few hundred meters. An elderly engineer standing nearby whispered, "One day, we will cross oceans through the sky." Few believed him. History would prove otherwise. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States continued growing. Without decades of repeated European conflicts draining resources, transatlantic cooperation expanded more rapidly. Scientists exchanged ideas. Factories imported advanced machinery. Universities built international partnerships. The Atlantic Ocean became less of a barrier and more of a bridge. One autumn afternoon, inside the Imperial Academy of Paris, a professor addressed his students. He held up two objects, a musket and an electric telegraph key. He asked, "Which one will shape the next century?" The students answered immediately, "The telegraph." The professor smiled. "Correct, because communication changes civilizations faster than conflict ever can." Outside, the streets of Paris buzzed with life. Electric lamps illuminated wide boulevards. Horse-drawn trams shared roads with early steam-powered vehicles. Factories hummed. Universities overflowed with students. The city had become a laboratory for the future. Break time 2. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Europe stood on the edge of another transformation. Break time 2. Not another great war, but another great leap. Electricity, flight, modern medicine, global communication. Humanity had entered an age where ideas spread faster than ever before. And because Waterloo had ended differently, the 20th century would begin with hope instead of fear. One bullet in 1914 killed 20 million people. In our timeline, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I. But in this timeline, the war never happened. Imagine a 20th century where the trenches were never dug, where the bombs never fell on London, Berlin, or Tokyo. This is the story of a world that chose a different path. It all started with a single document, the Treaty of Brussels, signed decades earlier. It did not create world peace overnight. It did something much more practical. It created a habit. It forced leaders to talk before they marched. The European Council, a permanent diplomatic body, sat in constant session. Every major power had a seat. The debates were long. The arguments were incredibly fierce. Sometimes representatives walked out in anger, but the doors stayed open. The conversation delayed the shooting, and in July 1914, that delay saved the world. When the Archduke was shot, the gears of war started turning. Mobilization orders were written. Millions of young men prepared to march. The newspapers screamed that the end of civilization was here, but the council met within 72 hours. Diplomats from Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and Russia sat around one massive wooden table. The room was hot. The tension was suffocating. For 3 weeks, they traded accusations. They threatened each other with ruin. But they kept talking. Eventually, they agreed to a joint international investigation. The mobilization orders were quietly canceled. The crisis stayed local. The World War was avoided. An entire generation of young men went back to their farms and factories instead of dying in the mud. Without 2 massive wars to rebuild from, the economy exploded. The 20th century became the great age of innovation. But this time, technology did not advance through military research. It happened in civilian laboratories. By the 1940s, commercial airlines connected every continent. Tourism flourished. Students traveled across borders without passports. Scientific cooperation became the norm. Space exploration started decades early. There was no Cold War, no space race between 2 bitter rivals. Instead, a multinational coalition of scientists pooled their resources in the 1950s. On a clear night in 1967, a human set foot on the moon. The astronaut did not plant a national flag. He planted the emblem of a global scientific alliance. His words were simple. We came together because no world is discovered alone. Back on Earth, the digital age arrived ahead of schedule. The internet grew out of university research, not military defense networks. Medical discoveries were shared instantly across borders. Cancer treatments and vaccines wiped out diseases decades before they did in our world. One afternoon in a quiet Paris classroom, a teacher showed her students a portrait of Napoleon. A student raised her hand. Did one battle really change all this? The teacher smiled. It wasn't the battle. It was what people chose to do after it ended. Silence filled the room. Outside, children played in parks where trenches had never been dug. They saw a train station filled with tourists, not soldiers. The museums around them held inventions, not weapons of mass destruction. Of course, this world was not perfect. It still had economic crashes. It still had political arguments and social struggles. Human nature did not magically change. But the great cities of Europe were never reduced to rubble. The scars that define our modern world simply did not exist. As night fell over the continent, the lights flickered on in Paris, London, and Berlin. They shone not as divided capitals, but as partners. High above them, satellites orbited the planet. They looked down on a world that had finally learned a difficult lesson. Peace requires just as much courage as victory. As the new millennium approached, humanity stood ready for its next great chapter. Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Because of that single day, the year 2026 looks completely different. There were no world wars, no massive global conflicts. Instead, Europe spent 2 centuries building a massive peace treaty. In this version of 2026, the old European Council of Brussels is the center of the world. It is the longest-running peace organization in history. Its headquarters are in the very palace where Napoleon once gathered the leaders of Europe. The building is old, but the goal is still the exact same. Paris is not just a city for art and fashion anymore. It is the global capital of science and engineering. The Imperial Polytechnic, which Napoleon started during his reforms, is now the top university on Earth. Students travel from every single continent to study there. Every student walks under a massive stone archway with one sentence carved into it. Progress belongs to those who share it. Travel is also completely different. High-speed magnetic trains connect every major city on the continent. You can get from Lisbon to Warsaw in just a few hours. Electric planes cross the Mediterranean using clean energy. Break time 0.3 seconds. There are still borders. People still speak different languages. But moving between countries is as easy as crossing the street. The continent is totally connected, but nobody lost their culture. The legal system is another big change. The Napoleonic Code became the foundation for laws all over the globe. But these laws did not spread through war. Trade and treaties, property rights, equal court systems, and civil rights became normal decades earlier than in our timeline. Technology also moved much faster. Without the destruction of 2 massive world wars, scientists never had to stop their research. Medical breakthroughs happened decades ahead of schedule. Major diseases were wiped out before our grandparents would have even been born. Cities never had to rebuild from ashes. Instead, they spent their money on clean energy and public transit. By 2026, almost all of Europe runs on advanced nuclear fusion, wind, and solar power. This same teamwork took humanity to the stars. The first permanent base on the moon was built by a joint European project. Mars came right after. The biggest city on Mars has a very strange name. They call it New Waterloo. It is not named after a battle. In the center of the Martian city, there is a giant bronze statue of Napoleon. He is not holding a sword or riding a horse. He is just holding a folded piece of paper. The inscription beneath simply reads, "The hardest victory is lasting peace." Back on Earth, people visit the Museum of European History in Brussels. Thousands of tourists walk past one specific display case every day. Inside is Napoleon's brass field telescope from the actual Battle of Waterloo. A young boy studies it with fascination. He asks his teacher, "Did this telescope change history?" The teacher smiles. "No. The man looking through it did." Outside, life continues. Scientists leave research laboratories. Diplomats arrive for another council meeting. Artists perform in public squares. Children play beneath monuments that never became ruins. Trains glide silently across the continent. Aircraft cross the skies without fear. Almost nobody stops to think about how close history came to a different path. Only the history books remember that everything around them started because one battle ended differently. If you look down from space, you can see the lights of Paris, Brussels, Vienna, Berlin, and Rome. They all blend together into one giant glowing network. The Earth just spins in silence. It is a simple reminder. History does not change because of miracles. It changes because people decide to build a different future. History remembers the big battles, the victories, the defeats, the names carved into stone monuments. But history is rarely changed by a single battle alone. It changes through the quiet choices that follow. Tonight, we explored one of history's greatest turning points, the muddy fields of Waterloo, a place where 50,000 men fell in a single day, and a place where the future of Europe hung in the balance. In our timeline, Napoleon lost. The Congress of Vienna reshaped the map. The French Empire came to an end. The 19th century followed the path we know. But inside this archive, one morning unfolded differently. The ground dried sooner. The artillery fired earlier. The Imperial Guard broke the British line. And history took another road. Could Napoleon truly have built a more peaceful Europe? No one can know. Historians still fight over what would have happened next. A victory at Waterloo would not have solved every political challenge. It would not have guaranteed lasting peace. But it would have changed the choices available to every nation. And sometimes, history changes not because outcomes are certain, but because possibilities multiply. Break time 0.3. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this timeline. Wars may shape borders, but institutions shape generations. Armies may win battles, but laws, education, science, and diplomacy build civilizations. Inside the Museum of European History, the final visitors quietly leave. The lights begin to dim. Only one gallery remains lit. At its center, beneath crystal glass, rests Napoleon's weathered bicorn hat. The same hat he wore at Waterloo. Nothing about it seems extraordinary. No jewels, no gold, only simple black felt marked by time. A little girl asks her father why everyone is looking at an old hat. He smiles. He tells her they are not looking at the hat. They are thinking about the decision made by the person who wore it. She stares at the display for a moment, then quietly nods. Outside, Brussels continues its evening rhythm. Diplomats leave the council chamber. Students fill cafes to discuss tomorrow's ideas. Trains glide silently through the city. Church bells echo across ancient streets. Life moves forward because more than 2 centuries ago, leaders chose negotiation over endless revenge. The camera slowly rises above Belgium. Then Europe. The lights of Paris, London, Berlin, Rome, Madrid, and Vienna shine beneath the night sky. No continent is perfect. None ever will be. but each generation inherits the chance to choose differently. Higher still, Earth turns silently among the stars. Borders disappear. Only one fragile world remains. Ancient parchment begins turning. One page, then another. The final page closes. A bronze seal is pressed into warm red wax. The emblem of the hidden archives appears. The archive is complete. Tonight, we imagined a world where Napoleon won at Waterloo. Tomorrow, another forgotten possibility waits to be explored. Because history is not only the story of what happened, it is also the story of every future that almost existed. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep challenging certainty, keep exploring the roads history never took, and never stop wondering, what if? Thank you for opening another hidden archive. Until our next journey, good night. Something just woke up in the basement. The old globe is turning by itself. A map is spreading across the table. It shows a town that does not exist anymore. There is a fresh red dot on our house. We need to leave right now.